This presentation summarises the main findings of the Great Western Woodlands Land Use Planning Scoping Study. The study was commissioned by the Woodlands Initiative, an open forum with representatives of each of the major groups with a stake in the future of the woodlands. The main purposes of the study were to establish stakeholder views and preferences towards a land use plan, and from this determine the planning models that would best fit the woodlands and its particular sets of values, stakeholder interests and land uses. The study has been undertaken by Andrew Del Marco of Ironbark Environmental, along with myself, Andrew Huffer of Andrew Huffer & Associates. This presentation includes only a small portion of the report content. Stakeholder views on land use and conservation in the Great Western Woodlands were sought through an online survey and formal and informal interviews. From this consultation, we found that there was probably more common ground across stakeholders than might otherwise be expected. In total, 63 survey responses and 22 interviews were used to undertake an assessment of stakeholder preferences and positions on issues relating to the development of a future land use plan. A big thank you goes to everybody who contributed to this part of the study. Some of the key messages that have been drawn from the above consultation are: 1. Stakeholders generally want to see better overall management of the Great Western Woodlands, and that this landscape scale work is a priority for them. 2. Scientific experts agreed that the area needs both landscape scale management and protection of key significant areas. 3. Most stakeholders want clearer environmental objectives, and that should mean something at a sub-regional scale. 4. Stakeholders will be more supportive of land use plan if it does not mean more red tape. And 5. All stakeholders need to have a give and take approach to negotiations to develop a land use plan in which most lands will be zoned for different multiple use arrangements. I'm now going to hand over to Andrew Del Marco, who will take us through some of the more technical aspects of the report.
The report suggests a three-phase approach to preparing a land use plan for the woodlands. This approach is more of a steady as she goes type of approach that aims to bring people along in the process rather than a more formal consultation, draft report, final plan type of approach. So here is a brief description of the three phases of a possible planning approach. The first phase is about continuing to develop the goodwill between stakeholders. It leads to development of a written land use planning policy that sets the high level objectives. It should involve gathering data, preferably map-based information, to support the plan, and could also involve on-ground projects to either collect information to support the plan or directly address management issues. Phase 1 also needs to see stakeholders reach agreement on the two elements of Phase 2. There are two critical elements to Phase 2, a sub-regional planning process and the development of a conservation plan for the woodlands. 4 sub-regions are suggested to reflect the major socio-cultural catchments in the woodlands. These are shown here. The sub-regions are to enable local communities to define and interpret what land use planning actions are required for their patch of the woodlands. The sub-regional planning is where more geographic or spatial land use planning may be possible. For example, this might include the identification of strategic infrastructure corridors, or the identification of culturally significant landscapes, or strategic conservation management areas or actions. Conservation is best defined through a conservation planning exercise for the woodlands, with the involvement of the sub-regions of course, and this is suggested as the other main element of Phase 2. The role of conservation planning in the land use planning process is not well understood by stakeholders, and even professional land use planners don't often integrate conservation well into land use planning. But conservation planning can help the Woodlands Initiative in at least two major ways. Firstly, it can help identify priority management actions across different parts of the area, and this can help identify the most cost-effective actions or the ones that will deliver the biggest bang for the buck. Secondly, conservation planning can flag areas that, because of their special features or other values, are the highest priority for protection or strict land access standards. Conservation planners, though, need guidance from the initiative on what objectives the plan or the conservation plan is to achieve. This most likely would be an exercise for the Woodlands Initiative group to work through with scientists and researchers from all spheres, that is, government, academia, and the mining sector, and the other stakeholders. Again, the key message is to establish the common ground before unleashing a conservation planning exercise. In terms of the most basic conservation objectives, the scientific and research experts tell us that the main aims are to prevent and manage disturbance and conserve species at all scales, that is, local through to regional scales. These objectives should lead to a raft of actions that maintain landscapes, unique environmental features, and ecological processes. The eventual land use plan could be made up of 6 components and include the overarching policy that was first produced in Phase 1. Secondly, a land use zones map, with most of the land use zones being multiple use zones. Thirdly, overlay zones to ensure broad landscape scale objectives for any land use. 4. Identification of collaborative projects to support the plan. 5. An information and monitoring system, including broad assessment of intactness or disturbance across the landscape. And 6. Any optional mechanisms to guide land use standards. These might include codes of practice for different land uses. These components all work together and can be developed over a period as resources permit. Finally, the report makes 9 recommendations for the initiative to consider. These are firstly, that the Woodlands Initiative should carefully consider the implications of establishing a land use plan and the recommended planning approach. A stakeholder-led process will require external funding, but may be superior to a government-led process, given that stakeholders would be in greater control of the process and negotiations. Number 2, the preparation of a land use plan for the Woodlands must be carried out in full consultation and with the significant involvement of all the major stakeholders. 3, the preparation of the plan should be carried out by a professional land use planner with neutrality and sufficient expertise in strategic planning, participatory approaches to plan development, conflict resolution, and environmental protection. 4, stakeholders willing to be part of the plan's development should reach agreement on a methodology and timetable for the plan's development. 5, any resultant plan can be adopted by the Woodlands Initiative as an advisory document for all willing groups and stakeholders to voluntarily adopt. Adoption by key groups should not necessarily bind all stakeholders in that sector. 6, implementation of the plan would be dependent on ratification by involved groups and stakeholders rather than by government. However, this should not preclude it from being used in the future as the basis for government policy. 7, any land use plan should include base information on the relative mineralisation values across the region, but this is likely to require refinement prior to its use in a land use planning process. 8, any land use plan must also include clear statements for all the major land uses and stakeholders, including mining, conservation, traditional owners, tourism, pastoral land use, the town sites, infrastructure provision, timber harvesting, carbon storage, and so on. And finally, meaningful conservation objectives are sought by the majority of stakeholders, including the mining industry, and critically underpin any land use plan. That concludes this brief overview of the study's findings. If you have any need for information or copies of the report, please contact any member of the Woodlands Land Use Planning Project Working Group. Thank you.